This is CyberSound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity, with your hosts, Jason Pufall, Stephen Maresca, and Matt Fusaro.
Welcome to CyberSound. I'm your host, Jason Pufall, joined today by Matt Fusaro and Steve Maresca. Hey, guys.
Hey, everyone.
Hey there.
So I don't know that this topic needs tremendous introduction. I think if we just say we're going to talk about zero trust, that's a buzzword that I think everybody's hearing in the cybersecurity space today, right? I mean, it's akin to AI, really, right?
Yep.
And similar to AI, I think there's a lot of people who say, well, what is zero trust? What does it actually mean? Why do I need to be doing it? Why are we even talking about it? So I think the first thing we have to do is simply try and define a little bit what zero trust is to anchor it for people, right, so they can then start to determine what their path forward might be.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also recognize that zero trust isn't necessarily a product you can buy, right? It's almost just a feature of a solution, right? Zero trust is a new security architecture, and new, I mean,
right,
this was really around 5 to 10 years ago, right? Hasn't really caught up. Products didn't really catch up to it until recently, right? Where we have the ability to do all these identity and context-aware things now. So that's why you're hearing the buzzword all of a sudden. We have the ability to do it now.
And to put, to address the elephant in the room, people are thinking about it because people worked from home for 2 years.
Right.
They had many incidents caused by loosening, network access and things of that sort.
Mm-hmm.
That's the type of thing that zero trust, as an architecture at least, has historically been described to address.
Right. So zero trust network access is what is driving the conversation right now, or ZTNA. You'll probably see that in a lot of marketing material as well.
And so what does that mean?
Right. So you're putting three different things together. Usually when you're talking about network access, you want to know identity, right? We want to make sure that you are the person you say you are when you're connecting to a network, whether it's inside the network or outside of the network, right? Next, you want some context. Where are you coming from? What devices are you coming from? Should you be allowed to access these applications, this data, et cetera, whatever the scenario is, right? And then you'll want to do some type of posture checking, right? Is this device safe? So things like making sure certain software is installed, such as endpoint security, OS patches, maybe. There's quite a big list, right? It really depends on the vendor solution or what you want to evaluate before a person actually comes into a network and interacts with data or applications.
Yeah, and the truth is that, many organizations have shifted to this hybrid environment where they have some on-prem resources, they have some cloud resources. Right. The very notion of inside the network or outside the network is far squishier than it used to be. It's uncertain.
Yeah, we talk about it all the time, how identity has become the firewall, right? You no longer have a boundary anymore. And this is an attempt to solve that problem by using those three things I just talked about to identify if that person should be accessing what they're accessing.
So the models, right? I think you certainly see vendor products from the network space, no doubt.
Oh, sure.
And I'd say you see applications suggesting that they're a zero trust application. And you say naively, as we've moved to more of a sort of hybrid environment where people really aren't in the office, how do you deploy some of those network zero trust capabilities? Do they require that traditional VPN? Are there other creative ways that these are being addressed?
I think it's my opinion that the more network biased zero trust solutions are built for organizations that are still broadly on-prem.
Correct.
Because they are in a transitionary phase between, local offices where they have a boatload of users, a lot of devices and their key data, and a shift to a far more fluid cloud provider SaaS type of environment. So if you're an organization that meets that type of description, you might be interested in a zero trust networking type of model.
Yeah, and on the other side of that too is organizations that have moved to the cloud, they want to make sure that the way you're accessing those things isn't on the Wi-Fi at Starbucks, right? They want to make sure that you're if you're on that network, that you have a secure tunnel to access those things, encrypt your traffic, so that if there is things in plain text for some reason or session information, that stuff is protected from the endpoint all the way to the application.
Common challenges in that environment, at least things that I encounter regularly, include provisioning software from a traditional model where endpoints contact an on-prem server that's behind a firewall, not accessible to the world, to the other model where they're roaming in the cafe, at home.
Yep.
That's a huge hurdle for some organizations.
Yeah, I think identifying what groups of people should be accessing things becomes more difficult, right? That's always been a challenge for all organizations, but it's at the core of this type of deployment. So you have to have a really good idea of who should have access to what and under what circumstances now as well, right? That's that context and device posture policy that you're going to have to deploy in order for this to be effective. So it's a lot of discovering, what types of policies should I be adhering to at an organizational level, and then from a security level, et cetera. It's going to be a decent amount of work to get to where you want to be.
But in large part, a lot of these solutions do require, on the network side, either tunneling back to a central location for policy management, or maybe being physically present in a central location. If you're doing a network-based zero trust solution, ultimately you have to apply a policy somewhere. So you're gonna move traffic somehow to a central location. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, that's kind of the allure of a lot of these solutions, is that they dynamically set up these tunnels for you, right? So application A, application B, they each have their own tunnels, their own sessions. They go through a central point, or I believe the technical term for it is a trust broker that manages the connections and manages saying who can do what. But all that is kind of abstracted away from the administrators and the users, so that they could just access applications in a secure manner.
Right. Okay. So how about maybe the flip side, which is we're going to move away from that network-based model and maybe try to deploy technologies that protect local resources, a workstation for an individual, right? Because there's definitely software out there that would say, we're going to whitelist applications, deny everything by default, do a whole variety of application-based controls, and I think that oftentimes they'll call themselves sort of zero trust solutions.
Yep.
Is that a model that is legitimate that some companies might need to look at?
Yeah, I think it's totally fair to say that you're zero trust at that point. That's part of the model, right? Always assuming compromise and always assuming that you shouldn't have access to it until someone says you should, right?
I think the distinction is that the historical model applied security policy at the edges, at the boundaries.
Right.
Zero trust is setting policy at some central location, likely cloud accessible, and then applying it as close as utterly possible to where that data is used or where the endpoint is actually executing. That's the key distinction. I think that it means a lot when talking about allow listing applications, for example, because it's a scenario where it comes down to the actual running of a tool. Whereas, in a different environment, it might be more applied with, who is allowed to install the application or what applications are permitted to be installed. It's a different model entirely.
Yeah, this whole model helps from an attack standpoint in that you can't just abuse an identity so easily anymore, right? You have to be in the right place, accessing the right applications, sometimes at the right times, et cetera. So all that put together is now granting you access or denying you access. Instead of, well, I'm this user, and it might be a compromised user at that point, I can get access to whatever data that person had access to. Not true anymore, right? So it makes it more difficult for an attacker.
I think, Steve, you made a good point at the beginning, which is why is there so much discussion about this? And certainly I think the last couple of years have had a big effect on that, right? That transition of people out of the office, because the concept isn't that new. Without a doubt, the idea of zero trust or whitelisting things that are permissible, sort of restricting or blacklisting everything else has been around for a long time, but it's really difficult to pull back from your users access that they're used to having. And I think that's one of the challenges for implementation. Telling people, well, yeah, you used to be able to do this, but now you can't. And their workflows or your general, sort of business practices, don't necessarily support that well. They're not easy to do, and it positions, a lot of times your security professionals, your IT folks as kind of the bad guys implementing these.
It's interesting in some respects because I think it does, to your point, in a broader sense, it turns it on its head for organizations that are not necessarily, they don't have a heavy capital flow at the moment. Their revenue's, down. They're at their next hardware refresh cycle, potentially. 2020 till now certainly emphasized personally owned devices. That was the case prior to 2020 for newer organizations that aren't, necessarily flush and building out hundreds of workstations. That I think is part of this. It enables zero trust and related architectural decisions, enable leaner operation to some degree, because your users can bring whatever they prefer. Your users can bring whatever they can afford. And as long as they can have an internet connection, they're able to function. That's the appeal. There are plenty of our customers that are coping a lot with office space constraints. Leases are higher. Landlords are imposing higher restrictions. Physical management of people, just in that raw sense, is something that is also a major driver. And if you don't have to pay for the endpoint hardware anymore, and
even better,
right?
You're saving money in general, but it causes a shift in the way that policy is applied because it means that it's not owned.
Well, but I want to be careful. So it's not just bring your own device and everything's secure. It's bring your own device that then perhaps has software in it or policy applied so that you can validate that, right, that it's secure.
It's a shift towards imposing agents,
right?
Imposing posture checks. Because if you can't do those things, then that device is not allowed to access.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so you can easily turn this into a benefit to employees, because there's a lot of people who say, I've already got a laptop. I'm content to use that. Can you just let me use it so I don't have to carry multiple of these things around or try to separate as much as we do? Like some of these things are real benefits to people, being able to have fewer devices in some cases, if you can validate, of course, that the device is secured and and their teenager isn't running Steam or who knows what else on these things, right?
Yeah, and you would only ever in the past have one chance to determine if that laptop is good or not, right? Is it configured properly? Does it have endpoint security on it? And then you send them on their way. Now you can continuously evaluate at access time, at every access, that those things are in place.
Okay. Any reason that people shouldn't be thinking about zero trust? There's certainly plenty of chatter about it. It seems reasonable, but
I'd say if you don't have a good handle on who should be accessing what, you don't have a good inventory on your applications and access restrictions, policies, etc. That stuff has to be in place before you can even move into a zero trust type of architecture. Otherwise you'll have the technology in there, you just won't know what to do with it.
So actually, I got a comment about that, which is a lot of the products that you see will suggest that you run them in what they'll call a learning mode for some period of time to try to address exactly what you just described, which is, hey, we don't know anything about what people are running. Run these things open, but in learning mode for a few weeks or a month or whatever it is. Get your inventory. And then once you think you're reasonably comfortable with that, lock it all down and deal with the few problems that come out of it. I mean, that's a model a lot of these folks recommend.
It is, but there's nothing wrong with approaching it that way, right? There's another potentially alternative model, or more complementary model, I suppose, which is data centric. If businesses are in a regulated environment, they know that they have to meet minimum protection guarantees for consumer data, for private information, things of that variety. If a company can build a robust data inventory to understand where their truly sensitive information resides and the users that need to interact with it when, this is a much easier conversation. Because rather than, I don't know who said it a moment ago, lock it all down. You don't have to lock it all down if somebody doesn't have the data.
Fair. Yeah.
It makes it a far more pleasant user experience for the end users that don't require that type of robust security, and potentially cheaper from a licensing standpoint overall.
So
Right.
it might be an interesting conversation if we went down the path of how many people actually have a robust data inventory.
Nobody
right?
does.
Right. And that's the challenge, right?
But
Yeah.
but that's okay.
But that's the trade-off, right?
right.
It's
Is
the
that
trade-off.
if you don't have it, then you're probably going to be restricting people that don't.
or
have it restricted.
understand that it might be more expensive up front, but you can
Right.
reduce costs by gaining that visibility over time.
And that's why everybody's building that idea of that learning opportunity in there, right? Because frankly, all of the vendors know that it is a percent of businesses out there that really understand where their data is or what it is, it's, whether they're regulated or not, right? It's just a
Right.
reality. But
Yeah, and even with the learning capabilities of a lot of those things, one thing that I personally don't think you'll ever get any benefit on is the identity piece, right? If you have a poorly constructed identity system or you're sharing accounts, it's going to be really tough to implement something like this. From a zero trust of applications, that's fine, but when you're talking about things that require identity to be part of the solution, then yeah, you're going to have to get that correct first.
yeah, that's totally reasonable. Okay. Is there? I mean, I feel like we talked about so the network. I guess the network space for zero trust. Probably that application space for zero trust. There's a lot of vendors out there. There's a lot of approaches, really. So, explore the space based on the way that your business is constructed today, the way your employees are coming to the office or not. Right? There's a variety of ways that you can look at this. I mean, I feel like we'd all recommend though that people do explore products in the space and the viability of their business move in that direction, right? Because it's difficult. It's really difficult to protect people in our traditional sort of network fashion. Things are absolutely moving and shifting, and people need to pay attention to that.
I think just in a passing thought for me, the key foundational technologies that are critical, like if you don't have these in place, you're not ready for zero trust. You need multi-factor authentication. You need some sort of client provisioning and deprovisioning that's cloud-based or at least cloud-capable. You need identity federation. That takes a lot of different forms, but it means synchronizing your identities in an externally usable way from potentially on-prem to Azure, to Google, to third-party services so that you can work with cloud apps.
And make sure the third parties you're working with actually support this too. Yeah, there's still third parties out there that won't authenticate against your directories. Look elsewhere, in my opinion.
Right. I'm mentioning these at this point just because zero trust is a great target for organizational trajectory. But if you're not at those earlier parts, if you don't have those technologies in place, you're just not ready to move toward that direction yet. And it needs to be part of the strategy.
Okay. I feel like it's a good overview. I mean, that was the goal of this, to just define what zero trust is a little bit. And I think try to take a little bit of that confusion away from the space, or maybe educate a bit what options are that are out there. Certainly, we recommend people looking at it. And as always, if people want to have a more in-depth discussion about the nuance that is zero trust, we're happy to have that. Reach out to us at Vancord on LinkedIn. We can continue the conversation from there. As always, we hope you got some value out of this. It got you thinking a little bit, and we appreciate you listening.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to get in touch at Vancord on LinkedIn or on Twitter at Vancord Security. And remember, stay vigilant, stay resilient. This has been CyberSound.